Okay, so I wanted to talk to you. This is just a quick little 5-minute lightning talk about continuous integration, which is actually a big passion of mine. I've done continuous integration at a few of the companies I worked with, and I've always enjoyed that part of improving processes for a company. And Bitrise happens to be a sponsor today, so I figured I would use Bitrise every time we're talking about continuous integration. So some of you may not even be familiar with what continuous integration is. So I'm just going to start by explaining like what it is, why we do it, and how we get set up. And then I've got just a few little tips of some other things you can do to improve your continuous integration even further, maybe if you already have one running. So let's say you're working on a small application just on your own. Your workflow might look a little bit like this. There's you in the middle, you're communicating with your Git repo back and forth, pulling down code, pushing some code up. And when you decide that it's time to push something to the App Store, you build and sign it on your own computer, and then you deploy that directly to the App Store. That's great. But as your team grows over time, where do you go from there? Well, you can set them up with the ability to build and sign themselves. But what we see often happening at companies in practice is that it might actually look like this. You have many team members, and only one person is really responsible for getting things to the App Store. And maybe that's just because you're working on a team that's constantly changing, or you have some like temporary contractors that you don't want to give the certificate to. So a lot of teams that I've worked on, there ends up being a flow kind of like this. There's many developers, but still only one person is getting asked to like do the builds and deploy them in the App Store. That's great, but then what happens when this person goes on vacation or suddenly gets sick and you can't even reach them? You've lost your ability to deploy to the App Store. So what can you do to fix this? There's a few different things, but if you couldn't, you can either say generate new certificates for one of your other developers, and you only get a limit up to about 3 of them total. So you may be in a situation, depending on how you're using these certificates, where you actually need to revoke their access and give access to someone else. But that doesn't really fix our problem. We're just sort of shifting things around, and as your team grows, it becomes more and more unwieldy. Like I said before, you only get 3 certificates, so you can only hand them out so much. And these are supposed to be private as well. Really, you want them on as few computers as possible, or maybe you don't even want the developers to be directly responsible for both writing the code and getting it all the way to the App Store if you're maybe in like a very large enterprise organization or something. So what you need is continuous integration. And when you use continuous integration, your flow looks a little bit more like this. Your team just continues to work with Git, communicate with Git, push their code, but then Git, whatever Git service you're using, GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, will be communicating events to your CI server so that it knows to run builds and deploy things to the App Store. Or maybe you're just doing a pull request and then it's letting you know whether that pull request succeeded or failed when it attempted to build it. And this scales really well because your team can actually just get massive and you never have to worry about them getting access to the App Store and being able to sign and deploy because everybody communicates through Git instead. And Git is much better for lots of people collaborating on than building things and deploying them to the App Store. And your continuous integration can also do other things that make it kind of convenient, like messaging out to Slack and letting people know if a build has succeeded or failed, or providing a link to where they might be able to download the IPA. So hopefully I've convinced you that continuous integration is something worth implementing. There are 2 ways that we can do it. The first way is to run your own CI server on a dedicated machine that maybe you already have, or maybe you buy a new one, and then you could run Xcode server on it, or an open source platform like Jenkins. Another solution is use a third-party CI service like Bitrise. And I find that this is a very cheap option to get started. You don't have to buy your own machine. You don't have to do the maintenance every time Xcode updates. They're taking care of that for you, so you can just focus more on your code. So once you've made that decision, there's a few things you need to do to get your CI server set up. You need to give your CI server access to Git and the signing certificate so that it actually has everything it needs to pull the code down, do the signing, and deploy things to the App Store. So once it's got its access, you're going to have to configure your build trigger or your Git events, like what kinds of things are actually going to kick off builds. Maybe it's the creation of a pull request or a new tag, or every time a commit is made to a branch, there's all sorts of different possible triggers. You can even just schedule one, like nightly. I always make a build. And then you need to configure your pipeline steps, like all the things you actually want to do once you've pulled this code down. And really the key steps are getting build, test, deploy. That's really what you need to actually get something out to the App Store. Build, test, deploy. So if you're looking for like, what are the first steps I should be starting with when setting up a CI, you should be getting a build, test, and deploy phase. If you use something like Bitrise, it'll probably start you off with a build and test, and then you might have to like add the deploy step yourself. If you're using something like Fastlane already too, it could just run your Fastlane commands for you, because maybe you'd prefer to just keep some of the configuration in Fastlane as well. And that's totally fine as well. So that's great, but I mean, like, there's got to be more than that, right? Just build, test, deploy. Like, I didn't get up here just to tell you about how to have another computer do the thing you can already do yourself. But one thing that I think that is really, really good for CI is the way that it can help enhance your pull requests, because you could do all sorts of additional analysis on them, such as performing linter and regex checks against your code files, just to make sure that there's nobody performing any bad practices that you don't want in the code. Or maybe they've focused one test. I definitely have seen this one come up many times. You work on something, you start focusing one test, and then without even realizing it, you commit that code. And now every time people run the test suite, they're testing one test rather than, well, the entire suite. So things like doing things to make sure that people aren't focusing tests or adding to-dos can be added as part of the automated feedback. So that's not even something manual that someone has to do when they go and do the review. Enforcing specific Git practices, making sure maybe even a ticket number is always associated with a PR. Sometimes we get into a pull request and we don't actually really know what the feature is about because there's not a lot of information in there. So really the key to this is letting your colleagues focus on the bigger picture details. When you can automate some of this linting, regex checks, and just get that feedback every single time someone makes a build, that takes the lift, that lets colleagues not have to worry about being, after those little details, because they just look at the code from a bigger picture perspective. Now, if you're wondering about how you can do something like that, I strongly recommend Danger CI, which is something you can put into your CI system. You can actually write it's like Danger file is a single file where you write different rules about checks you want to do against your code. You can actually write it in JavaScript, Swift, and Ruby. I'm most familiar with Ruby, and I thought they had some of the best test examples on the website, so I just copied some of these over. So you can see, like, the first one is just checking that you aren't focusing on one test in any of your tests. And the next one is checking how many commits you have and if any of them contain a message that says merge branch, because maybe you don't like merge commits or you want people to squash. So automate ways to tell people about those things so that those don't become the burden of whoever's doing the review themselves. And that's everything. So happy integrating. If you haven't heard of Bitrise, I strongly recommend checking them out if you'd like to learn more about continuous integration. If you have any questions about CI or Bitrise, feel free to ask me, because I've used it a little bit myself and I've really enjoyed it. They have a really nice interface, and I think it actually matters to have a nice interface for your CI. I hate the way Jenkins looks. So yeah, that's everything. Thank you very much.